Este ano, dentro do programa do Congresso Virtual da
This year,
Sociedade
within the
Médico-Espírita
program of our virtual
Internacional,
Congress
nós temos o grande
of the
prazer
International
de trazer
Spiritist
a
Medical
professora
Association,
Célia Dantas
we have a great pleasure
para
to
nos
bring
elucidar
Professor Célia
sobre
Dantas
o pensamento
to
na sua
enlighten us
forma onda-partícula.
about
A
thought
professora
in its wave
Célia
particle
Dantas
form.
é professora de física da
Professor
Universidade
Célia
Federal de Goiás
Dantas
desde
has been a
1996.
professor of physics
Ela é
at the
doutora em
Federal
física pela
University of
Universidade de São
Goiás
Paulo
since
e a sua área
1996.
de pesquisa
She
inclui
holds a
óptica
PhD in
quântica
physics from the University of
e
São Paulo,
fundamentos
and
de
her research
física
area includes
quântica.
quantum optics
Ela
and
também
fundamentals of quantum
estuda
physics.
os
She
fenômenos,
also
os fundamentos da
studies
física quântica
the
e
phenomena
as suas
and the
conexões
fundaments
com os
of quantum
princípios
physics
espíritas
and its
na
connections
solução
with
de alguns
the Spiritist principles
paradoxos.
in
E
the
é um
solution
grande prazer
of
realmente
some
receber a professora
paradoxes.
Célia
It is
e eu
a
espero que
great
todos
pleasure having Professor
aproveitem
Celia,
muito esta
and I
palestra
hope
e nós
everyone
teremos
enjoys this lecture.
depois, dentro
We
deste
will have
programa,
later,
também
within this program,
uma área
a
para
session for
questões e
questions
respostas em que
and
vocês
answers,
poderão mandar as suas
where you
perguntas
can
para a
send your
professora.
questions
Com vocês,
to Professor
professora Célia.
Celia. With you, Professor
Olá a
Célia
todos.
Dantas.
É
Hello,
um prazer
everyone.
muito grande estar aqui participando desse
It is
segundo
a
congresso
great pleasure to
virtual
be here
de
participating in the
medicina
second
espírita,
virtual Congress of
devido à
Spiritist
pandemia, né?
Medicine.
Segundo
Due to the
congresso e a
pandemic,
pandemia ainda está
it's the
em
second
andamento.
virtual Congress, and the
Queria
pandemic
agradecer a
is
Sônia
still in
Dói, presidente
progress.
da AMA Internacional, pelo
I want to
convite.
thank Sonia
É uma grande
Doi,
honra estar aqui.
president of SMA International, for the
Bom,
invitation. It's
a
a great honor
apresentação
for me
nossa
to
para
be
a gente
here,
falar
Sonia.
sobre
Well,
o
our
pensamento, né,
presentation
na
is to
sua
talk
dualidade
about
onda-partícula.
thought
Eu vou
in
dividir
its
minha apresentação da
wave-particle
seguinte
duality,
maneira.
and I am
Primeiro,
going
eu vou
to
falar
break
de
up my
alguns princípios
presentation
da
as
física
follows.
quântica, né? Um pouco
First, I
bem
am going to
rápido,
talk about some principles of quantum
focando
physics,
principalmente
a
a
very quick
dualidade
overview,
onda-partícula, que é o que nós
focusing
iremos
mainly on the
utilizar como
wave-particle
ferramenta, né?
duality, which is
Depois que
what
a
we
gente
will use
falar
as a
sobre
tool.
pensamento, a gente vai falar
Then, I will
rapidamente
talk
sobre o
about thought
paradigma
and briefly
cérebro-mente,
talk about
né?
the
O
brain-mind
que é o
paradigm.
pensamento, como que
What
ele
is
funciona,
thought?
né?
How
Quais
it
são as
works?
partes do cérebro envolvidas e o
What
tipo
are
de
the
pensamento
parts
que
of
nós
the brain
temos, né?
developed?
De acordo com a
And the
doutrina
types
espírita
of thought
e
we
tudo
have
mais.
according
Então,
to the
essa aí
Spiritism
é a
and so on.
sequência nossa da
This will
nossa
be the sequence
apresentação.
of our presentation.
Então, um breve tour aqui pela física quântica.
So, a brief overview of
No
quantum
final do
physics.
século XIX, a
By the
física
end of
clássica
the
já estava
19th
assim, muito bem
century, the classical
estabelecida.
physics was very well
Sabia-se como as
established.
partículas se
They knew
comportavam,
how particles
sabia-se
behaved,
muito bem como que as
they
ondas
knew
se
very well how
comportavam.
waves behaved.
Partícula era uma coisa,
Particle
onda
was
era
one
outra,
thing and wave was something else,
separada.
separate.
Pensava-se que
They
praticamente não
thought
havia
that
mais
there
nada a
was
se fazer.
practically
Os grandes
nothing else to
problemas
be
já
done.
estavam resolvidos, né?
The big problems
O
were already solved.
eletromagnetismo,
Electromagnetism,
termodinâmica, as máquinas
thermodynamics,
térmicas,
thermal
tudo.
machines,
Lord
everything.
Kelvin, né?
Lord
Ele tem uma
Kelvin
frase dele que
has
diz o
a
seguinte: a
phrase
física é
that
um céu
says,
azul, com pequenas nuvens
physics
no
is a
horizonte.
blue sky
Só
with
que
the
essas
small
pequenas
clouds on the
nuvens no
horizon.
horizonte a que ele se
But
referia
those little
eram alguns
clouds on the
problemas
horizon
que
to what he
não
referred were
davam
some
conta de
problems that
resolver,
they
mas não estavam
couldn't
impactando
solve.
assim propriamente, né, o progresso da ciência, da
But they
física em
weren't
particular.
really impeding the
Só que no
progress of
amanhecer do
science,
século XX, essas
and
pequenas
physics in
nuvens no
particular.
horizonte do céu azul, elas
But
se
at the
juntaram e
beginning of the
formaram uma
20th
imensa
century,
tempestade,
these small
que
clouds on the
apareceu
horizon of
com
the
o
blue
nome de
sky
física quântica,
came
né,
together
devido
and formed a huge
primeiramente a
storm,
Planck em
which happened
1900
under
e
the
Einstein em
name of quantum
1905.
physics.
Acontece que um pequeno
First
problema
with Planck
que
in
chamava a
1900
atenção,
and
né, que estava
after with
relacionado com a
Einstein in
radiação
1905.
em cavidade,
It turns out that there was a little problem that caught our
nos veio
attention,
mostrar
which
uma
was
nova
related
maneira da
to
gente ver o
cavity
mundo,
radiation.
sabe? A física
And
quântica, ela
it
participou
showed
da
us
maior
a
revolução
new way of
filosófica,
seeing the
né, do
world.
século XX.
Quantum
Então foi
physics
o
can be
Planck, né,
considered the
que em
greatest philosophical
1900, com o
revolution of
trabalho
the 20th
pioneiro dele,
century. So it was
que deu
Planck in
origem,
1900,
né,
with
surgimento à
his
física
pioneering
quântica,
work, who gave rise to the
que é
quantum
contrária à
physics,
nossa intuição, né, a intuição
which is
do
contrary to our intuition,
E por isso ela pode
the
ser considerada a
phenomena
maior
intuition.
revolução científica e filosófica
And
do
that is
último século.
why it can be considered the greatest
Esse
scientific
problema
and
que
philosophical
surgiu,
revolution
né,
of the last
que foi
century.
a origem, toda a
This
origem da física
problem
quântica, ela
that
estava
came up,
associada
which
com a
originated the
radiação do
quantum
corpo negro.
physics, was
Então, é o seguinte, a
associated
gente tem uma
with
caixa fechada, lá
black
dentro
body
tem
radiation.
energias, né?
Let's say
Então,
that we
no
have a
corpo
closed
quente,
box, and
ele
inside
emite
it there are
radiação. Então,
energies,
eles faziam
a black
experimentos
body
com a teoria.
that
A
emits
teoria
radiation. So they
dizia que
performed
dava uma curva
experiments,
mais
and
ou
there
menos
was a
desse jeito,
theory
né?
which said
Essa linha
it
traceada.
had a
E
curve
as
more or less
experimentos
like this
mostravam
dashed
mais ou
line
menos
here.
desse jeito. Até que a
And the
teoria e o
experiment
experimento, elas eram
showed
de
a
acordo
curve
para
like
pequenos
that.
comprimentos de onda, né?
The
Para
theory and
baixas
experiment
frequências.
were
Mas
in
quando você
agreement
chegava
for small
nas
wavelengths,
frequências altas,
low
que é o
frequencies.
ultravioleta, né? Que é o
However,
espectro
when it came
eletromagnético
to
que
high
vai do
frequencies,
infravermelho
which is the
às raio
ultraviolet,
que
because the
considerado a luz
electromagnetic spectrum
visível,
goes from
e aí vai
infrared,
para o
passes through a band, here it
ultravioleta.
is,
Dava uma
considered
diferença entre
visible
teoria
light,
e
and then
experimento
goes
muito
to
grande.
the
Por
ultraviolet.
isso,
There was a
a
very
teoria da
big difference
quantum
between
resolvência, né?
theory
Ela
and
ficou conhecida
experiment.
na literatura como
For
a
this reason,
catástrofe do
and because
ultravioleta.
no one was able to solve it, it became known in the literature as the
Aí a
ultraviolet
diferença é que é o seguinte, aquela
catastrophe.
radiação na cavidade,
The
ela era
difference
considerada
is
como
the
sendo
following:
qualquer valor.
that
Era um
radiation in the
valor que a gente
cavity
chama de
was
constante.
considered to have
A gente
any
pode
value.
associar isso daí a uma
As an
van. Você
example,
tem
a
qualquer
value
valor,
we call
né?
continuous.
O que o Planck fez
We
para
can
tentar
associate
resolver esse
it with a
problema da
ramp where you
catástrofe
have
dele
continuous
foi
values.
ele
What Planck did to try
teorizar,
to
né,
solve this
que a
problem
radiação
of
que
the
está na
ultraviolet
cavidade, ao invés dela
catastrophe
ter qualquer
was
valor,
to
ela tem que ter
theorize
valores
that the
contínuos,
radiation that was
certo?
in the
Diferentes.
cavity,
Ela
instead
só
of
podia
having
ter
any
alguns
value,
valores
continuous
discretos,
values of
tá?
energies.
Para a gente
It
representar
could
pontos
only
cardíacos.
have some
Vamos ver uns
discrete
números
values,
naturais, né? 2,
which we
3,
represent
tá?
here as a ladder.
Que são números
Set of
inteiros,
natural
os
numbers,
valores.
1, 2,
Então, a
3,
energia, ela é
which are
escrita aqui,
whole
certo? Ela é
numbers.
proporcional à frequência. A energia é uma
So
constante, né?
energy
Que
is
você diz,
written as being
constante Planck.
proportional
Como essa
to
energia
the
só pode ter
frequency
alguns
of a
valores,
constant
significa que
that
ela só
became
pode ter
known
algumas
as the
frequências
Planck
e
constant.
alguns comprimentos
As
de
this
onda.
energy can only
Quando você
have
fez
some
essas
values,
contas,
it
mostrou
means
que
that it can
poderia
only have some
resolver o
frequencies and
problema.
some
Então, a
wavelengths.
princípio,
So
a
when
física
Planck
agora
did these
seguinte, o céu
calculations, he
realmente
was able
azul
to solve the
e nem
problem.
aquelas nuvenzinhas
At
tem
first,
mais.
now
Tá?
physics would be a really
A
blue
ideia
sky and not
Planck
even
é o
those little
seguinte,
clouds would exist anymore.
a gente sabe que quando a
Planck's
gente
idea is
tem
this.
ondas que a gente chama
We
de
know
ondas
that when we
estacionárias na
have
física quântica,
waves
que
that are
você
called
amarra as duas
standing
pontas
waves,
dela, as
like the
extremidades,
string of a
então
guitar
só
that you
aparece
tie
alguns
both
modos
ends
normais
to
de
it,
vibração. Então,
then
normal, só tem algumas
only some
frequências, alguns
normal modes of
tons, né?
vibration appear.
Que são os
There are only a
harmônicos.
few frequencies, a
Para
few
isso que
wavelengths,
acontecer, é
which are
fundamental que essa
harmonics.
radiação, né,
For this to
do
happen,
corpo
it is
quente emitindo
essential that the
radiação,
radiation
ela esteja
from the
realmente
black
dentro de uma
body
caixa,
emitting
tá?
radiation
Seria
is
equivalente a isso
actually
aqui do violão.
inside a box.
Só que o que
It
que
would be
aconteceu?
equivalent
O
to the
Einstein,
example of the
um
guitar.
jovem, na época, 23
But what
anos,
happened is
ele
that
chegou à
Einstein,
conclusão de
a young
que
man
esse
at the time,
resultado da
23 years
energia ser
old,
quantizada não
concluded that
dependia do
this
fato dela estar
result
numa
of
caixa. A
energy
natureza
being
era assim,
quantified does
sabe?
not depend on the fact that it is in a box, because nature was like that.
E aí ele
And
propôs
then
que o seguinte, que a
he
radiação
proposed the
livre, né, que
following.
está viajando,
The free
mesmo fora de uma
radiation,
caixa,
which
ela
is
também seria
traveling even
quantizada.
outside a
Ou seja, ele
box,
associou uma
would
onda
also
a
be
uma partícula. Ele falou
quantified.
assim,
That is,
que
he
a radiação também
associated a
podia se
wave
comportar
with a
nessa
particle
natureza
and
corpuscular,
theorized
né,
that the radiation
de
would
partículas.
also behave with
O
this
Planck ficou quase
corpuscular
doido, né? Ele
nature.
falou, nossa, mas
That
esse
is,
trabalho, porque o
particles.
Planck era o editor da revista, né?
Planck was going crazy. He said,
Disse que
wow,
que
but
recebeu o
this
trabalho do
work.
Einstein
Planck
era
was the
tudo
editor
infalível. Então ele
of
falou
the
assim,
physics
nossa, ele
journal.
não entendeu o meu
And
trabalho.
he was the
O que
one who
acontece?
received
Nesse caso,
Einstein's
eu
work to
reconheço que a
review.
radiação também
So
tem
he
uma
said
caixa. Então ele
he
consegue
didn't understand
explicar
my work.
é,
Everything that
a
happens in this
quantização, né,
case
dessa
is
frequência para
because the
medir.
radiation
Mas
is
fora
inside the
da caixa
box.
isso não é
Then you can
possível.
explain the
Só que o
quantization
Einstein
of frequency
explicou que
and
era possível,
energy.
que era
But
assim, que a
outside the
energia, na
box, it is
verdade,
not possible.
ela
But
parece que é um
Einstein
contínuo,
explained that it
mas
was
ela é
possible,
formada de
that
pequenas
energy
partículas, né,
seems
que
to
eles
be a
chamam essas
continuum,
partículas de
but in
fótons.
fact, it is made up
E
of
aí,
small
os
particles
alunos da
that
prova vão
he
poder
called
aí
photons. And then the burden of proof was not on him. Whoever doubts that proves it. And many experiments were done, and it was shown that the light really was quantified. From there, the foundations of quantum physics began to emerge. If Einstein was not enough, another physicist named de Broglie came up. He studied history, but later became a physicist. He said, if light, which behaved as a wave, was proven to also behave like corpuscles, called photons, why a corpuscle, for example, an atom, a molecule, a small particle, cannot behave like a wave? So he postulated this could also happen, and it would be the complement. Light, which was a wave, could behave like a particle, so particles could also have a wave-like nature. And at that time, the photoelectric effect, Einstein's theory, had already been proven. Einstein was consulted about this idea and said, if no one proves the opposite, we must consider it is correct. De Broglie had his 4-page doctoral thesis approved. It concluded that both radiation and matter have a dual nature. When Einstein showed the possibility of waves, radiation, behave like particles, they didn't stop being waves. This just introduced a new property of radiation that it wasn't known. So wave and corpuscular nature are complementary, and this complementarity, both in radiation and in matter, has consequences that are called uncertainties, because quantum mechanics is not a fully predictive theory like classical physics. It is done in terms of possibilities, uncertainties, which is what we are going to talk about. So the true quantum physics is about matter behaving as waves, which is de Broglie's theory. There is also a quantum theory of light from Einstein's, but quantum physics basically treats matter, that is in the microscopic world, in the world of very tiny things, atoms and molecules, as waves with immense technological applications. Nowadays, we have the electron microscope, which is based on using the electron as a wave and has a much higher resolution than the optical microscope, which uses light. De Broglie proposed that the electron, for an example, a particle that has a small mass, can behave like a wave, and the wavelength we call lambda, given by h, which is the Planck's constant, over p, which is the linear momentum, is the mass times velocity. So quantum physics is this: particles or waves, which we can call wave particles, a combination of wave and particle. They have intrinsically a dual nature. They can behave like a wave or a particle. What makes a wave particle behave like a particle or like a wave is the way that you do the experiment. In quantum physics, many have heard about the role of the observer, who together with the object forms the complete system. But this observer, in fact, is the kind of experiment to which a wave particle is subjected. So, the experimenter is the observer. And for example, if you have a wave particle and you throw it here in a gas chamber, it will collide with the gas molecules and leave a track. From the track, you deduct its nature as a particle. You are seeing where it is going, the path it is taking. If you do a double-slit experiment, where you throw it here, it will behave like a wave, because it will split here, part of the wave goes into one slit, part of the wave goes into the other slit. The reset of the two waves will give you an interference effect that is characteristic of the wave. Then the experiment will invoke the wave or particle nature. But before a measurement is made, it is a wave particle, intrinsically wave and particle. The wave property of matter, for example, a quantum object like an electron, it can be in more than one place at the same time, because if the electron behaves like a wave, the wave cannot be located. The wave, which represents the electron, is called a probability wave and is different from a mechanical wave. But let's imagine a mechanical wave only to understand it's not the nature of the electron. A mechanical wave would be when you drop a pebble into a lake and form circles, ripples. Those circles are waves, but the electron is there and here. It is not localized. It is in more than one place at the same time. And what is the wave collapse? We cannot say that an object actually manifests itself here in space-time until we observe it as a particle. So if the electron is a particle, if I calculate it in quantum physics, if I drop it here in my room, it could be anywhere in the room, so I can't tell exactly where it is. I can say, for example, that the probability of it being there near the sofa is greater because it likes to watch soap operas. It has less chance of being at the sink because it doesn't like to wash the dishes, but it's likely to be everywhere. Only if I take a measurement am I able to locate it. I found it here, watching TV. If I don't measure the electron as a wave, we can't say that it has an existence that we observe. It is a wave or what? A probability wave. It exists as a probability. Another feature of quantum physics is the atomic electron transition. This is the model of the atom. This blue ball here in the middle is its nucleus, where the positive charges are, and the electrons rotate here in the orbit. So the electron can only move into a few orbits. It can't be everywhere. When it jumps from a higher energy orbit to a lower energy orbit, where did the energy difference go? It emitted a photon, right? And it only goes from a lower energy to a higher one if it absorbs an amount of energy. That is, if it absorbs energy like a photon. However, according to quantum theory, the electron can only be in that orbit or that one. In this space between them, it is forbidden, from the electron's point of view. So, what happens? For the electron to make its quantum jump here, it's like it disappears from this orbit and reappears in another orbit, which is another weird thing in quantum physics. So, quantum physics, quantum mechanics, is based on some postulates and principles that are in number of 4. What are these principles of quantum physics? The principle of complementarity, which says that the corpuscular and wave models are complementary. If, to a certain extent, I observe the wave character of radiation or matter, it is impossible to prove the corpuscular character of the same extent and vice versa. Bohr's correspondence principle, quantum theory's predictions for the behavior of any physical system, correspond to classical physics in the limit of large quantum numbers. So quantum physics is theory-based physics. It's completely based from classical physics, but it has the correspondence in the limit of large quantum numbers. The uncertainty principle is a consequence of the wave-particle duality. So, I cannot simultaneously measure the corpuscular and wave nature. The position, for example, is associated with the corpuscular nature. Our particle has a well-defined position. A wave does not have it. And the linear momentum, that is, its velocity, a constant associated with the wave characteristic. Then, the wave particle is neither wave nor particle. The error in measuring position and momentum generates this uncertainty. Here, the delta x and delta p are errors, which means you will never observe the corpuscular and wave nature simultaneously. And there is the Pauli exclusion principle, which says that there cannot be more than one fermion occupying the same quantum state. For example, The electron is in orbit. It is in the quantum state corresponding to each orbit. If it jumps from one orbit to another, it jumps from one quantum state to another. Fermions are electron-like particles. When we study the world of fundamental particles, we can divide all particles that exist into two types called fermions and bosons. Fermions are characterized by having half spin, and bosons full spin. Later, when we talk about this principle, I'll explain better what it means. So the uncertainties are consequence of the wave-particle duality, the fact that it's not possible to associate only a wave or corpuscular nature to the particles. So there is an uncertainty relationship between position and momentum, intensity and phase of a wave, energy and time. So could we speculate about an uncertainty relationship between spirit and matter?
É isso que a gente vai começar a falar na hora que a gente quiser colocar os princípios espíritas, né, dentro da mecânica quântica para solucionar alguns paradoxos, igual nós comentamos.
That is what we are going to talk about when we explain the Spiritist principles through quantum mechanics, to solve some paradoxes, as we said before. So we propose that the spirit has a different nature from matter, and that there is an intermediate element, which is made of these two components, matter and spirit, having a dual nature, which is our perispirit. The matter that our perispirit is made of is dual in nature. Our perispirit has a spiritual component and a material component, and we cannot separate matter from spirit. As the spirit evolves, the perispirit nature becomes quintessential, refined. Its material nature is decreased. The spiritual nature predominates. When we are less evolved, we are more matter than spirit. But even when we are more spirit or more matter, we cannot separate the two. It is a dual nature. So imagine a body that has a dual nature, like in quantum physics, where you cannot say the electron is a particle or a wave. It is both. It is dual in nature. Our perispirit is similar. Our perispirit is made of cosmic fluid. It has a dual nature, both matter and spirit, that cannot be separated. For example, Jesus Christ, who is the most evolved spirit on earth, his perispirit must have been 99.999% spirit, and only 0.001% matter. But it is still dual in nature and cannot be separated. Only God is only spirit.
Então, física clássica versus física quântica, né? As diferenças principais entre a teoria clássica e a quântica é que a teoria clássica...
So let's look at classical physics versus quantum physics. The main difference between classical and quantum theories is that classical theory is strongly objective. You drop a particle here, and you know where it's going to be, how fast it's going to go. In a minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, everything is defined. But not in quantum physics. Particles do not have this certainty. They are described in terms of waves, possibilities, causal determinism. Quantum physics are based on uncertainties, complementarities, which means that nothing is defined, that everything can change. A measure, an interval between one measure and another, many things can change. In classical physics, the nature of particles, the measurements, are local. In quantum physics, it is non-local. In classical physics, epiphenomenalism and consciousness are the main differences between classical physics and quantum physics. We talked very briefly about some of these concepts, only to give you an overview, but we can come back to them later if necessary. So, to talk about thought, first we have to talk about the brain-mind paradigm. At this event, there was another lecture talking about brain-mind. And it may even be unnecessary, but I'll quickly put our concepts here to complement our talk. Is our brain a fantastic computer that we still need to decipher? Or does it have non-physical properties? Does the mind evolve and control this biological robot? So we have two theories, from the dualists, who believe that there are two types of substances, the mental and the physical, and who also believes that the mind is different from the physical brain, and the materialists, who are a minority, and with neurological research, they conclude that mind and brain are one.
Que conclui pesquisas neurológicas que mente e cérebro são uma coisa só, né? Para nós aqui, nós já partimos do princípio de que são...
We assume that there are two separate things, mind and physical brain. We are dual in nature. Our perispirit is dual in nature, and we are spirit and matter. And then we talk about thought. We already assume that it is a spirit which thinks, feels, commands. The body and the organs serve only as an instrument of the spirit's manifestations. And this body ceases its existence as soon as the spirit leaves it. So, the spirit continues to exercise all the functions it had been connected to the body in a greater degree, such as intelligence, will, memory, consciousness, because the spirit is no longer limited by its bodily prison. But this same spirit still has a body, which is the perispirit. When we are incarnated, we have one more body in addition to the perispirit. So there is very little change. It is like one layer has been removed. We assume that thought is not a secretion of the brain, not like bile, which is a secretion of the liver. The body exists only for the spirit to manifest itself, and we assume that bodies have a double, the perfect triad, a spirit, which has no form, the perispirit, which resembles the physical body, and the physical body itself. So we are all together incarnated here on earth. In the spiritual world, we discard only this one. So we continue to have a spiritual body for the spirit, our perispirit. That way, our spirit has its spiritual body. The perispirit has a dual nature. And what is this duality? It has a spiritual component and a material component. Hold on. Isn't our physical body that has already been discarded the only material element here? No. The physical body is material, that's true. But our perispirit is also material in nature. But why don't we see the perispirit? Because there are several types of matter. Even though the perispirit is more refined, invisible to us, it is still matter. The perispirit is the go-between or intermediary for all the sensations experienced by the spirit, the means by which the spirit acts upon its fleshy organs and transmits its will to all that is exterior to itself. The spirit thinks, and the perispirit transmits the impulses to the body. The perispirit is like a translator who speaks two languages. The spirit does not understand the language of the body, so it transmits to the perispirit because the perispirit has a spiritual nature. For example, the spirit speaks English, but the body only speaks Portuguese. So the perispirit talks to the body. It is an intermediary between the spirit and the body. Because the perispirit has this dual nature, it receives the impressions of the material body and transmits it to the spirit by its spiritual nature and vice versa. This is how the communication between the spirit and the body is done, through the perispirit, which has a dual nature, which is made of the cosmic fluid. This fluid, more or less condensed, produces the different kinds of beings in creation, the material bodies, the imponderables, essentialized, and etc. As the constitution of our body, we are atoms that form molecules. For example, a molecule of water, H2O, is formed by 2 atoms of hydrogen and 1 of oxygen. Likewise, the molecules form the cells, tissues, organs, the structure of our body. Where would our thought come from? organs, tissues, our thoughts are related to the basics, that is, the atoms.
Aqui, ele vai estar relacionado nos fundamentos aqui, ó, nos átomos. Tá? Então, vamos só imaginar o que é o átomo aqui, que é essencializado, né?
Let's imagine the atom here, which is essentialized. Remember that molecules are made of atoms, and molecules form cells, tissues, and so on. Let's see the base of our essence, which are our atoms. Here we have a three-dimensional model of the so-called Bohr model. What is this model? Although we have more elaborated models in quantum physics, this one is quite a good example. Here is a nucleus, where the positive charges are called protons, and there are also neutrons. There are two types of particles here, red and blue, protons and neutrons, and the electron, which is spinning in orbits, only in the orbits where it is allowed, and the most it can do is jump from one orbit to another. So this electron spinning here generates a magnetic field. There is also a spiritual atom, which is the atom that forms our spiritual body. For example, when we die, our physical body doesn't exist anymore. The body goes down to earth. But we still have a body, and this body is similar to that we had on earth. Even our shape is the same. So it is still the same structure made up of atoms, which make the molecules, which make the cells. Our body is an imitation of the spiritual body. Hernani Guimarães studied the model of spiritual atoms, which he called the psi atom. Psi is the spiritual matter, and we have the electrons, protons, and neutrons. He named the electron a bion.
Ele deu para o próton o nome bion, tá? Desculpa, o elétron, né, que anda aqui na eletrosfera, ele deu o nome de bio pelo seguinte. O elétron, como ele é uma carga elétrica...
The electron, which circulates here in the electrosphere, and it is an electrical charge in motion. It is called an electric current. The moving charge is current. Electric currents generate a magnetic field. So this electron generates a magnetic field. And the spiritual electron here, being a moving spiritual charge, is a current and also generates a field. And Hernani Guimarães tried to measure these fields, which he called biomagnetic field. This is a field that, although possible to be measured because he had several positive measurements, it is much weaker than the physical field, difficult to be perceived. He measured these biomagnetic fields, and he called this spiritual electron bion. He called protons percepton and neutrons intellecton. So our spiritual atom called psi atom from psyche or soul. The only difference would be that this spiritual atom or psi atom would be in a four-dimensional space. Here on Earth, we live in three dimensions, but spiritually, you can add at least one more dimension, or several. It's hard for us to even imagine what a fourth dimension would be, being stuck here in three dimensions. We can't even conceive what a fourth dimension means. But imagine if a person lives in a flat, two-dimensional world. How would you explain the third dimension to him or her if he or she is stuck in two dimensions? It's not complicated. It's a dimension here, an axis, but the perception would be missing. Similarly, we lack this perception to understand one more dimension beyond these three. Therefore, the three-dimensional model of the spiritual atom is represented by bions rotating around the nucleus and forming surrounding four-dimensional layers. In the book Genesis, chapter 11, item 18, it is written, "When the spirit must incarnate in a human body in process of formation, a fluidic connection, which is none other than an expansion of the spirit, attaches it to the germ toward which it finds itself attracted by an irresistible force from the moment of conception. Under the influence of the vital material principle of the germ, the perispirit, which possesses certain properties of matter, is united molecule by molecule with the forming body.
material do germe, o perispírito se une, molécula a molécula, ao corpo em formação. Então, na verdade, quando a gente vai reencarnar, nosso corpo espiritual, ele é miniaturizado, né?
So, when we are going to
Aí ele chega
reincarnate, our spiritual body is condensed and comes to the material life in the fertilized cell
e ele é
and is
ligado
connected
ali no
at the
momento
moment
da
of
concepção.
conception.
Então,
Then
imagina
imagine
como
what would
seria
be like to
encarnar.
incarnate.
Qual que é a diferença
What is the
de um
difference
átomo
between an embodied
encarnado e um
atom
átomo
and a
desencarnado,
disembodied atom?
né?
You shrink an atom,
Você
and this physical atom, like this atom down here,
né?
which is more indelible,
Aqui já
imponderable is the
E aí,
spiritual
o que
atom.
acontece?
It's
Esse átomo
connected
aqui,
here
ou esse
with
átomo
the physical atom.
que tá aqui embaixo,
You
que é
see,
mais
these
leve,
electrons
né?
spinning around here,
Vulnerável.
they generate a
Que
magnetic
seria o
field.
átomo espiritual,
So it's like
ele
you
tá
have the two
ligado ao
poles of the
átomo
field
físico,
here and
né?
irresistible
Porque, mas
force.
veja bem,
Thus,
esses elétrons
this is
virando
nothing more than an
protões, né? O que
embodied
acontece?
electron,
Então,
the
é como se
enlivening of
tivesse
matter
dois
through
polos
its interaction with the
uma força
spiritual atom,
positiva.
which is the
Tanto que nada
spirit
mais é do que
element.
elétron encarnado,
Disincarnating this electron here
A
means
vivificação
turning
da
off this
matéria pela
field that unites the
superação
two.
com o átomo
The
espiritual, que é o
spirit-matter
elemento
union
espírito.
is made through fields.
Desencarnar esse
There is no
elétron aqui
interpenetration of
significa
spirit
você
with matter. The
desligar
mutual
esse
influence
campo
between the
aqui, ó,
two
que une
is
os
always
dois, né?
done through the interaction between the fields
A união
and never through direct
espírito-matéria é
impact.
feita através de campos. Não se dá nenhuma interpenetração do espírito com a matéria. A influência mútua entre os dois é feita sempre através da interação entre os campos e nunca por impacto direto. Estava falando sobre essas questões aqui, para a gente entrar na questão lá do pensamento, como que funciona, onde que ocorre o pensamento, tá? E o que que isso vai ter a ver. Agora que isso aqui
I'm
já fica
bringing out
claro.
these issues so that we can get into the question of
A gente
thought,
tem nesse
how it
modelo aqui.
works,
Então,
where
quando a
thought
gente vai
occurs,
reencarnar,
and
né,
its relations.
o nosso
When we
perispírito ele
incarnate,
é
our
miniaturizado
perispirit is
e é ligado
miniaturized,
átomo a
shrunk.
átomo, molécula
It
a
is
molécula ao
linked
nosso corpo em
atom to
formação. Aí
atom,
ele acaba funcionando como
molecule to
molde,
molecule,
porque você tem um
to our
perispírito,
body
né? Ele só
information,
foi
and it
miniaturizado,
ends
mas
up
depois ele
working as
começa
a
a
mold
descobrir.
to the body.
E aí ele
I
funciona
mean,
como molde do
your
corpo
perispirit
físico.
was only
Por isso que,
shrunk,
por exemplo, tem
but
uma
as it
pessoa
starts
que
to develop,
atualmente
it
está se
works as a
sentindo na
mold for the
idade,
physical
está sem
body.
braço e tal. Se ela não conseguir resolver essas questões antes de reencarnar, ela vai passar esse molde para o corpo, vai gerar um corpo sem um braço aqui,
For
porque é
example,
da maneira como
there
ele
is a
foi
person who is mentally
miniaturizado, né?
crippled,
Ele
without an
acaba
arm. If he or she
funcionando
cannot
ali
resolve
como
this
um
issue
molde,
before
tá?
reincarnating, he or
E o
she
que
will
isso
pass
tem a
this
ver com o
mold
nosso
to the body
pensamento?
and will generate a body without
A
the arm,
gente tem vários
because
modelos
that is
tentando
the way it
explicar,
has
né,
been
como que é o
miniaturized,
pensamento,
like a
onde que ele
mold.
ocorre no
And
cérebro e
what does
tal.
this have to do with our
O que eu
thought?
vou falar aqui é
There are
um
several models
modelo que
trying
eu
to
uso, né, que
explain
a gente
what is thought,
trabalhou lá com a
where it
doutora
takes
Marlene.
place in the brain. What
É o
I'm going to
modelo
talk
de
about here is the
Hameroff-Penrose.
model I used when I
São dois
worked
dos
with Dr.
principais
Marlene,
propositores da
which is the
consciência quântica.
Hamnoff-Penrose model,
Então, o
the
estudo de
two main
Hameroff, ele é
proponents of
médico, né,
quantum
inclusive,
consciousness.
e diretor do Centro de Estudos da Consciência que fica em Tucson, no Arizona.
The study of Hamroff,
Roger
who is an
Penrose, ele é
anesthesiologist and director of the Center of Consciousness Studies in Tucson, Arizona, and Roger Penrose, who is an Oxford physicist and won the Nobel Prize in 2020 for a work he did long before being interested in conscience. During his youth, but he received the Nobel Prize only 2020. Roger Penrose, in partnership with Hamroff, formulated a specific model and sought to locate the brain structures where the quantum effects occur, which he calls consciousness, or thought. Their idea is that consciousness could emerge as a microscopic quantum state from a certain critical level of coherence of events happening in certain neurocellular structures called microtubules, which compose the neuronal skeleton.
Os ingredientes essenciais do modelo são os seguintes. Então, vamos ver aqui. O neurônio é uma célula...
The essential concepts of the model are as follows. The neuron is a highly specialized cell for transmitting information in the form of a nerve impulse. In these neurons, we have microtubules, which are formed by two molecules that we call tubulins. There are two represented here, one in green and one in yellow. They form tubes, which we call microtubules.
Elas formam tubo aqui, que eles chamam de microtúbulos. Então, tubulinas subunidades dos microtúbulos, né? Como se fosse
Tubulins are subunits of microtubules. It is as if tubulins were the bricks of a cistern, a well. They are coupled by internal quantum events and interact with each other cooperatively. So they form a microfilament. Tubulin contains yet another structure, a hydrophobic bag. And then we go from a biochemical level to the physical level itself. The quantum state of electrons are located in this bag. The tubulins are molecules formed from atoms. And atoms, as we have already seen, contain electrons rotating in the electrosphere with a nucleus. So in this bag, we have quantum states of electrons that, in conjunction with the alpha and beta monomers, which are tubulins, determine the conformation of tubulin as a whole. These conformations are similar to vibrational states, which create signals like waves. Inside the microtubule, there is an aqueous substance called ordered water, which insulates the oscillatory activity from the electrons in the bags.
Da tubulina como um todo. Essas conformações são semelhantes a estados vibracionais que criam sinais semelhantes a ondas. No interior do microtúbulos existe uma substância aquosa, né, que ele chama de água ordenada.
Ordered water prevents environmental decoherence from occurring at the quantum level. It is at this point and in this structure that during the pre-conscious process, a computation process takes place, maintaining a quantum superposition in the microtubules until a high collapse occurs. The quantum superposition of electrons in the bag becomes entangled quantumly and upwards with the other higher structures whose operation it commands, namely the microtubule as a whole, the synapses of networking neurons, culminating in the phenomenological area in perception or consciousness. The basis of such entanglement is supposedly the physical phenomenon known as Bose-Einstein quantum gas condensate. That is, when the person acquires consciousness.
Como condensação do gás quântico de Bose-Einstein. E aí a pessoa tem consciência. Então, em suma, porque explicar todos esses detalhes aí por si só é seminário grande.
In summary, explaining all these details would be a long seminar, but we can summarize it as follows. There are several electrons in those microtubules, and this consciousness, according to Hameroff-Penrose model, the physicist and the doctor, that means all the electrons, and there are a lot of electrons, they stay in the same quantum state. I don't know if you remember the fourth principle of quantum physics that says we cannot put more than one electron in the same quantum state, because the electron is a particle called a fermion. It has half spin.
Porque o elétron é uma partícula que ele se chama férmion, né? Ele tem spin meio, tá? Na verdade, nada.
In fact, nothing prevents placing them all in the same quantum state. But normally, we place each particle in a different quantum state. So each of these horizontal lines here is a quantum state. You can only have one electron in each quantum state. In contrast, the particles we call bosons can all be piled up in the same quantum state. This state here is called the fifth state of matter. It is different from solid, liquid, gas, or plasma. It was theoretically proposed by Bose, and Einstein worked with him on it.
Mas só que não existe impossibilidade total de você colocar, de você fazer condensado como esse usando.
There isn't a complete impossibility of making a condensate like this using electrons, but it's a highly speculative theory, and their model has been questioned many, many times. The main reason this theory is not acceptable is that years after they proposed this model, someone did some calculations.
Alguém fez uns cálculos e descobriu que o seguinte, que para os elétrons que estão nas estruturas
And found that for the electrons that are in the structures of the brain, in the structure of the neurons. For those neurons to evolve into the Bose-Einstein condensate, it would require a temperature higher than the temperature of the sun. So that made their model totally unfeasible, and then they even modified the model. When I was in Tucson at a congress, I made a proposal that they accepted. And what is this proposal which modified their initial theory? I combined Spiritist principles and the principles of quantum physics.
Essa teoria inicial deles. Eu coloquei a doutrina espírita, né, nos princípios lá da física quântica. Então, veja bem, para você conseguir colocar todos os elétrons no mesmo estado quântico, que é o que a gente
To be able to put all electrons in the same quantum state, which is what we call a Bose-Einstein condensate, and where in this model, consciousness would emerge. We would need a long seminar to talk about that. The electrons should be particles like bosons, which have a whole spin. So, in the hammer of Penrose model, there is only the physical atom. There is only the physical electron, and this electron has a half spin. Thus, it is a fermion. And unless you have the temperature of the sun, you can't get them easily all in the same quantum state and form the so-called fifth state of matter of Bose-Einstein to then have consciousness. However, when we use the Spiritist principle, in which each atom of our body is linked to a spiritual body, atom, atom, molecule, molecule, then each of those atoms, if we are incarnated, are linked.
Ele é ligado a corpo espiritual, átomo a átomo, molécula a molécula. Então, você imaginaria o seguinte, ó, cada daqueles átomos aqui. Se nós estamos encarnados, né, nós estamos ligados. Quando você imagina o elétron ligado ao bíon, que seria o elétron espiritual aqui, eles formam um par.
When we imagine the electron connected to the bion, the spiritual electron, they form a pair, a unit, because we are incarnated. Separated, both the bion and the electron are fermions, and the model is not complete. But if you consider them as a pair, as we've seen in several studies, the Cooper pair, they become bosons. The electron has a half spin, and the bion has a half spin, and when they form a pair, they have a full spin. So, the electron-bion pair is a boson, and the boson can form a state of consciousness. All in the same quantum state, they lose individuality, and then consciousness emerges. This explains why we need to be incarnated to think. When our physical body disincarnate, the atom here is separated, and the body doesn't think anymore. Have you ever seen a dead person thinking? They cannot even see anymore. That person is dead. It is over. The idea here, using the hammer of Penrose model, is that consciousness exists in the subunits of neurons, which are the microtubules. Here in the hydrophobic bag, electrons and everything emerge into a condensate, and consciousness then occurs. This will only happen if the electron is incarnated, and if it has a spirit attached to it. If not, you don't have consciousness. So the brain is quantic, and their model is good. But what commands? The commander is the spirit. Without the spirit, electron doesn't have its little pair. It doesn't turn into a boson, and its consciousness won't happen. A Bose-Einstein condensate is not formed.
Tem condensado de Bose-Einstein, tá? Mas a gente estando encarnado, tendo ligado ao nosso corpo físico, corpo espiritual.
But being incarnated, having our physical body connected, atom to atom, molecule to molecule of the spiritual body, our thoughts emerge. And again, I repeat, who thinks is the spirit, who wants is the spirit, and it manifests itself through the perispirit, which is the intermediary that transmits to the body and vice versa. So, being the spirit who thinks, our thoughts are also a mental magnetic wave. Every wave has a peculiar frequency, so not every thought is the same. People who are thinking vulgarities
aquelas
have a kind
pessoas
of
que estão lá
thought.
pensando
The
só besteira
enlightened person who is thinking about solving the
outra pessoa
problems of
iluminada
humanity
que
has
pensando
another
na
kind of
solução dos
thought.
problemas da
Every wave
humanidade
has
é
a
outro tipo de
frequency that is a
pensamento.
fingerprint
Cada
that cannot be
pensamento,
changed
né,
once the
ele
wave is
tem a
generated.
sua frequência, né? Toda onda possui uma frequência. A frequência da onda é a sua impressão digital. Ela não se altera depois que a onda é gerada. Então, a gente tem que tomar até cuidado com os nossos pensamentos, que depois que
So we
você
have to be
emitiu ele, você
careful with
não
our
pode,
thoughts.
né?
Once
Você não
emitted,
muda
that
mais aquela
frequency
frequência. Você
no
pode
longer
mudar seu modo
changes.
de pensar e
You can
emitir
change
outra
your
onda,
way
mas
of
aquela que
thinking
você
and
gerou,
emit another wave.
ela está no
But
meio
the one
ambiente, você
generated
é
before
responsável
is
por ele.
already out there,
A
and you
sua
are
energia está
responsible for it.
relacionada com a
Its
frequência.
energy is related to its frequency.
Quanto
The
maior
higher the
for essa
frequency of the
frequência da
wave, the
onda,
greater
maior
the
a
energy.
energia.
And in the case of
No caso das ondas
electromagnetic waves, light, for example, which is generated by a
são geradas
vibration
por
of
vibrações
electrical
de correntes
charges with a
elétricas, a velocidade
propagation
de
speed in
propagação
vacuum
dela
of
de um ar
300,000
é
kilometers per
300 mil
second.
quilômetros por
Now,
segundo.
mental
As
waves
ondas
are
mentais
also
também são
electromagnetic
ondas
waves.
eletromagnéticas,
André
né?
Luiz calls them
André Luiz chama de ondas
mentomagnetic waves, and they
mentomagnéticas.
also have a dual
Ela
wave
também tem
particle nature
natureza
and
dual,
propagate in
onda-partícula.
space and time, but at a
Se
much
propaga
higher
no
speed than
espaço e
that
no
of
tempo,
light.
porém com uma velocidade
Now
muito
let's talk about
superior
the
à
spiritual
velocidade da
atom,
luz.
the
Então, nós
spiritual
temos o
electron,
nosso
which is
átomo
also called a
espiritual,
bion.
o nosso eletroespiritual, que também é chamado de bion, né? Quando ele pula de uma órbita para outra, ele emite aqui, se for o átomo físico, ele emite um fóton.
When an
Se for o átomo
electron jumps from one
espiritual, vamos
orbit
dizer
to
assim, ele
another,
emite
it
um
emits a
fotonato.
photon. That is, if it is a physical atom. And
Emitir
if it is
uma
a
ideia,
spiritual
né?
atom,
Uma
it
onda
emits a plasma photon.
eletromagnética, nós passamos
By
a
emitting an
refletir essa
idea, which is a mental
perceber.
magnetic
A
wave,
ideia é
we
essa que
start to
para
reflect
não
those
se
that resemble
confundir
it,
com a
and the
intensidade
idea
correspondente
soon
à nossa
impregnates in
insistência
the
de
body,
alimentá-la.
with an intensity corresponding to
Mantendo-nos
our
assim
insistence
espontaneamente em
on
comunicação
sustaining
com
it,
todos que
spontaneously
desenvolvem o mesmo
keeping
modo
us
de
connected
sentir
with
ou
others
efeito
who
da
share the
ação.
same idea or feeling, which is the effect
Assimilação,
of
né, dos
mental
sons
waves
mentais.
assimilation.
O halo vital
The
moral
vital
de
halo
cada
or
criatura,
aura
ela
of each
permanece
person is like a
tecida de
continuous
correntes
woven
atômicas
of
sutis de
subtle atomic
pensamentos que são
currents of
próprios ou
thoughts
habituais,
that are proper
que é a
or
característica
usual
do
to
ser
them,
humano,
because the
que nós
characteristic
emitimos
of human
pensamento
beings is that
continuamente.
we
Quando que
continually
nós
emit
passamos
thought.
da fase
When do we
de
evolve
animal
from
para um
animal
animal?
to human?
Quando a gente
When we
passa a
start to
emitir
emit
pensamento
continuous
continuamente,
thought.
ele não para, correto? E os animais, por exemplo, eles têm um pensamento fragmentado. Então,
We don't stop
continuamente
thinking,
nós,
and
né,
animals have fragmented
essas
thinking.
forças em
These
constante
forces in
movimento
constant synchronous movements,
ou
or
estado
state
de
of
agitação
agitation by the
pelos impulsos da
impulses of the
vontade,
will,
estabelece
establish
para
for
cada
each person
pessoa
a
uma onda
mental
mental
wave of
própria,
their own.
né?
Tell me your thoughts, and I'll tell you who
Diga
you
os
are.
seus
I
pensamentos
really like this
e digo
book,
quem tu és.
Mechanisms of Mediumship
Nesse
by
livro
André
aqui,
Luiz.
que eu gosto
In chapter
muito, é um livro
4,
que
André Luiz
desenvolve
writes
muito
about
essa
thought,
chamado
which I found
mecanismo da
interesting to
mediunidade.
bring here
No
for our
capítulo
conclusion.
4,
Here he
intitulado
says that
Matéria
our thought
Mental,
is associated with the
o André
movement
Luiz
of
estuda
particles of our
fala de
spiritual
algumas coisas
atoms.
sobre o
He says,
pensamento, tá?
in a
Que
regular
eu achei
position,
interessante colocar
accommodated
aqui
to the
para gente.
usual impressions of a
Então,
regular
veja bem,
human
o nosso
being,
pensamento
the
está
whole mental
associado aqui
atoms
com o
that are
movimento
usually
das
excited in the
partículas,
sphere
né,
of
do nosso
thoughts
átomo
will produce
espiritual.
very long
Ele fala
waves,
assim, que
that
em
is,
posição
waves
vulgar,
that can easily
acomodada às
sustain the
impressões comuns da
individuality
criatura
that
humana normal,
correspond to the maintenance of heat.
os átomos
So, some types of
mentais
thoughts are
inteiros,
generated due to the atom
regularmente
as a
excitados na
whole.
esfera dos pensamentos, produzirão ondas muito longas ou de simples sustentação da individualidade, correspondendo à manutenção do calor. Então, veja bem, alguns tipos de pensamento, eles são devidos ao átomo como um todo gerar. Quando ele fala que isso é ondas muito
When he
longas,
says that
significa que
these
é
are very
frequências
long waves,
baixíssimas,
it
porque a
means that they
frequência ela é
have very low
inversamente
frequencies,
proporcional ao
because the
comprimento de onda.
frequency
Quando a
is
frequência é
inversely
muito grande, o
proportional to the
comprimento de onda é
wavelength.
muito pequeno.
When the frequency
Quando o
is very
comprimento de onda é
high,
muito longo,
the
ele vai ter
wavelength
só
is
aquele
very
pensamento
small.
bobinho,
When the
sabe?
wavelength is very
Eu acho que eu
long,
vou fazer um
it is often
brigadeiro,
a
sabe?
shallow thought.
Então ele fala que
Oh, I
corresponde
think
só
I'll
àquele
make some
tipo de
candies
pensamento,
today.
tipo de pensamento.
So
Independente
he
do
says that this type of thought corresponds only to the maintenance of heat, but we
Se
think
os elétrons
continuously.
mentais é que
If mental
se
electrons are
forem os
electrons that
elétrons
Hernani
mentais
Guimarães called
que
bions,
o Hernani
in the
Guimarães
orbits
chamou
of
de
atoms
íons
with same nature,
nas
the
órbitas dos
cause of
átomos da
agitation in
mesma
some common
natureza,
states of
a
mind,
causa da
for example,
agitação em
a
estados
reflection,
menos
an alternative
comumente,
thought,
por
a
exemplo, uma
prayer, The field of
a
thought will
ação,
express itself
né,
in
uma
medium
oração.
wavelength
O campo
or
dos
experience
pensamentos,
acquiring waves by
experienciar
the
em
soul,
ondas de
corresponding
comprimento
to the
médio,
production of
tá?
inner
Ou de
light.
aquisição de experiência por parte da alma, correspondendo à produção de luz interior. Então, o nosso tipo de pensamento, que é mais concentrado, uma prece e tal, já
So the
envolve
kind
o
of thought
movimento
that is
dos
more
elétrons.
focused,
Essa
a
energia já
prayer,
é mais
involves
alta,
electron
né?
motion.
Mais altas
This
energias,
energy is already higher,
e
of
comprimento de
medium
onda médio,
wavelength,
né? Frequências
medium
médias,
frequency,
médias
medium
energias. No
energies.
entanto,
However,
existe
there is a
tipo
type
de
of thought in
pensamento
which you
aqui
make the nucleus
em
itself
que você
vibrate.
coloca
The energy of the
para
nucleus is much
vibrar o
greater.
próprio
It is the
núcleo.
greatest
As
type of
energias
energy
do
that
núcleo, elas
exists,
são muito
hence
maiores
called nuclear
do que no núcleo.
energy.
Tá? O maior tipo de energia que existe que é no núcleo. Por isso que a gente tem a energia nuclear. A energia nuclear é você, fisicamente, né? É você tentar quebrar a energia que mantém essas partículas do núcleo juntas, liberar elas
Nuclear
para,
energy
né?
in
Por isso que chama
physics
energia
is used to
nuclear.
try to break down the
Se a
energy that
excitação
holds the
nasce
nuclear
dos
particles
diminutos
together
núcleos
and release them.
atômicos em
If
situação,
excitation
que
arises from
situação que a gente
tiny
consegue
atomic
colocar os
nuclei,
nossos
in what
núcleos para
situation
vibrar?
can we make our
André
nuclei
Luiz fala
vibrate?
que são as
André
dores
Luiz says
invisíveis
that
que
it
a
is in
gente
the
tanto
worst pains
rejeita,
that
né?
we usually
A gente às
reject.
vezes perde uma
Sometimes we
pessoa
lose a
ao
person and
redor
get
e a
angry.
gente suicida
Someone
porque
commits
perdeu uma
suicide because
pessoa.
they lost a person.
Essa
This
dor
pain makes
aí,
the
né?
nuclei get
Ela faz
excited and move. So, in
núcleos
extraordinary
aqui,
situations of the mind,
né?
in deep emotions, in
Solicitarem-se,
extreme pain,
né? Se
a very deep
movimentarem.
prayer makes the
Então,
thought
em
emit very
situações
short waves.
extraordinárias da
If the
mente,
wavelength is
as
very
emoções
short, the
profundas, dores,
frequency is very
laboriais,
high,
uma
its
prece bem
energy is
profunda, que essa não
immense.
é todo dia que
It is a
você consegue
transformative
fazer,
wave of the
o
spiritual
domínio do
field,
pensamento
and
ele
it
te
can
dá
even
raios
modify
muito
our mental
curtos,
field.
né? Se o raio é muito curto, a comprimento de onda, quer dizer que a frequência é muito grande, a energia dele é imensa. Ele é transformador do campo espiritual. Ele pode até mesmo modificar aqui o nosso campo mental, né? Dizimando várias doenças que nós temos, limpando, sabe? Seria equivalente aos raios
Emmanuel
gamas
says that in
espirituais,
many illnesses, clearing them out would be
né?
equivalent to
Os raios
applying
gamas aqui seriam os
spiritual
raios
gamma
gamas
rays.
espirituais. Isso aí é capaz
This
de
is able to
modificar o
modify
nosso
our
campo
mental field.
mental.
In
Então,
certain
tem
physical
certas
conditions, the person
condições
sometimes
físicas,
goes
né?
to meditate,
A
goes to a
pessoa às vezes sai
retreat,
para
to get
meditar, ela
to a
sai,
state of spiritual
vai
elevation
fazer um
that completely
retiro para ela
changes their
conseguir
mental field.
chegar num
This
estado
happens
que
at
ela
the level of the
consegue ter
atom.
essa
But
elevação
we
dela,
have
porque isso
three
aí muda o campo
conditions:
mental dela
make the whole atom
completamente,
vibrate,
tá?
which corresponds to the
Então é lá que
superficial thinking,
acontece, é no átomo,
make the
mas nós temos
electrons
três
vibrate,
condições. A gente põe o
which
átomo
generates
como um todo para
attention,
chacoalhar,
and in
o
some very
pensamento é
rare
o bolo,
conditions,
a
we
gente põe
can
os
make the
elétrons para
nuclei vibrate
chacoalhar, que já
and
é
generate a
uma
thought
atenção,
capable
e a
of
gente
changing your
consegue, né, em
entire inner
certas
self
condições
and the
muito
environment
raras,
in which you
colocar
are.
os próprios
According
núcleos
to
para se
Descartes, the
movimentarem
philosopher,
e gerar um
the essence
pensamento
of man
que é
is
capaz de
to think.
modificar
This is in
todo o
agreement
seu
with
íntimo e
Allan
arredondeza de
Kardec.
onde você
Allan
está.
Kardec says that the
Então,
human
segundo
face
Descartes,
begins
né, o
when we
filósofo,
start to
a
emit
essência do
continuous
homem é
thought.
pensar. Olha como está de acordo com Allan Kardec. O Allan Kardec fala que a fase hominal ela acontece quando a gente passa a emitir
I am a
pensamento
being who
continuamente.
thinks, that
Eu
is,
sou uma
who
coisa que
doubts,
pensa,
who affirms,
isto é,
who
que duvida,
ignores,
que
who
afirma, que
loves,
ignora, que
who
ama,
hates,
odeia, que
who
quer, não
wants,
quer,
who doesn't
imagina e
want,
sente. Por isso ele falou,
imagines and
penso,
feels.
logo existo.
That's why
Né?
Descartes said, I think, therefore I am.
Aqui
I'm going
uma
to share a poem by Adelino
poesia
Fontoura Chaves,
do
psychographed by
Adelino
Chico
Fontoura
Xavier.
Chaves,
The poem is
psicografado
called
pelo Chico
Journey.
Xavier, no livro
I
chamado,
was an atom
o poema
vibrating in the
chamado
forces of
Jornada, né?
space, devouring amplitudes, in a
Fui
long
átomo
and anxious
vibrando entre as
wait.
forças do espaço.
Particle landed.
Doravante amplidões
Imprisoned, I
imóveis
was a part
ansiosos
of the
quietos.
sea, wrapped
Partícula
heaps of
pousei,
seaweed. For
encarcerado eu
centuries, I
era.
was a plant in
Fusório
sparse
do mar,
movement,
emoções
suffered
de
in winter
sargaço.
and
Por
loved in
séculos de
spring.
planta em movimento
When I was an
escasso.
animal and in
Sofri
the
no
beast's
inverno e
instinct,
amei na
I
primavera.
found
Depois
intelligence
fui
and
animal e no
advanced
instinto da
step
fera
by step.
achei a
I kept the
inteligência e
expression
amancei
of the
passo a
gorillas for a
passo.
long time,
Guardei por
putting more
muito
faith in
tempo
the hands
a
and
expressão
more
dos
light in the
gorilas,
pupils,
quando mais fera as
fighting and
mãos e mais
crying so
nuas
that
as
I could
pupilas,
understand them.
a lutar e
Now
chorar
Man that I am, by the divine, I live body to body to forge the destiny that will lead me to transpose the glare of the
e me
stars.
leve a transpor o clarão das estrelas. Muita saudade da doutora Marlene, nossa eterna mentora.
I miss Dr. Marlene, our eternal physical and spiritual mentor. And may Jesus bless the planet which is going through this turmoil. I especially ask that you pray for Brazil because we are in need. Thank you so much for this opportunity, for listening to me. It was a pleasure to be here. And again, I hand over the floor to our dear Sônia Dói.
E passo a palavra de novo para nossa querida Sônia Dói.